This week on Jerusalem Dateline, after a drive-by murder, the U.S. ambassador and Israeli prime minister challenged the Palestinian Authority about the way it rewards terrorists for their crimes. Plus, a look at the top 10 countries in the world who persecute Christians. And Israel sets a record for tourists last year. We look at one of Israel's unique attractions, the Jesus Trail. All this and more this week on Jerusalem Dateline. Hello and welcome to this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. I'm Chris Mitchell. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu praised America's ambassador to Israel, David Friedman, for exposing the Palestinian Authority policy of paying terrorists for their lack of peace. The comments followed another brutal terror attack that left an Israeli father of 6 dead. Nearly $3,000. That's what Palestinian killers of an Israeli rabbi will likely receive from their government under what's known as pay to slay. 35-year-old Rabbi Raziel Shevach died following a drive-by shooting near his home in Samaria. The terror attack drew quick condemnation from U.S. Ambassador David Friedman, who tweeted, "An Israeli father of 6 was killed last night in cold blood by Palestinian terrorists. Hamas praises the killers, and PA laws will provide them financial rewards. Look no further to why there is no peace."
I want to congratulate Ambassador Friedman, the American ambassador to Israel, who tweeted the truth, unvarnished, straightforward. The important thing is that Abbas's government is supporting the kind of murderers that murdered the father of 6.
Congress is also targeting the policy with the Taylor Force Act. The bill, which has already passed the House, would withhold U.S. tax dollars from the Palestinian Authority unless it stops paying those who kill Israelis.
Such people in our jails get $355 million a year, they and their families, from the Palestinian Authority. That is something that is untenable.
According to figures released by the Israel Defense Ministry, the rabbi's killers will likely receive a salary 5 times the average Palestinian wage for the rest of their lives. Palestinian Authority records show the more serious the crime, the higher the pay. For example, a terrorist sentence to 3 to 5 years receives $580 per month. For a sentence carrying 20 to 35 years in prison, the monthly pay grows to almost $3,000. There are also bonuses ranging from $87 for a married terrorist to $145 for an Israeli Arab carrying out an attack.
Funding and incentivizing murder doesn't exactly advance peace. Here's the principle they're communicating to their people: kill an Israeli and get rich. Now, what kind of message does that send to impressionable Palestinian children?
President Trump also recently threatened to cut funding to another Palestinian institution, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, or UNRWA.
It's not a question of defunding UNRWA, it's a question of replacing UNRWA with, after 70 years, with an agency that will actually address the real needs of real refugees.
Since there is an overall UN effort for millions of refugees worldwide, Netanyahu sees no reason for Palestinians to receive individual attention.
This will not have negative effects, it will have positive effects, because the perpetuation of the dream of bringing the descendants of refugees back to Jaffa is what sustains this conflict. UNRWA is part of the problem, not part of the solution.
This week, Israel banned members of 20 activist groups from entering the country that support boycotting Israel. BDS is a grassroots movement which calls for boycotts, divestments, and sanctions against Israel. Last year, Israel enacted a law that would ban any activist who issues a public call for boycotting the Jewish state. Some of the groups are located in countries like the United States, France, South Africa, and others. BDS is one of the most powerful anti-Israel movements in the world today, and it's well-funded. Here's a story CBN's Dale Hurd did about the spread of BDS on U.S. college campuses.
BDS activists will tell you they're only defending the rights of Palestinians. But when they chant "from the river to the sea," they're calling for the complete destruction of Israel.
Our movement, the BDS movement, the Palestine Solidarity Movement, is finally starting to reframe the conversation, and that's why they're so afraid.
The BDS movement is growing and has become a force on more and more college campuses. It is aimed at only one nation, the only democracy in the Middle East.
No other country, just Israel.
Richard Millett tracks the BDS movement through his website.
They won't be calling for boycotts of America, who they don't agree with, or British government policy that they don't agree with, before we get into China, Russia, Syria, Saudi Arabia. There is no boycott, Dale. So you answer why.
The answer to that question can be found in the answer to another important question. Who founded the BDS movement? BDS leaders say the movement was launched in 2005 by the Palestinian Civil Society, but the evidence shows that is not true. Watch this video of BDS leaders discussing the origin of the movement at a conference in May of this year. Ilan Pape is director of the European Center for Palestinian Studies at the University of Exeter in England. He's considered a leading intellectual in the BDS movement. Here, Pape admits that the Palestinians did not create the BDS movement.
We're also active in it.
Well, the Palestinians launched the BDS in 2005 and 2004.
Yes, not really, but yes, okay. For historical records, yes. Okay.
That's important.
It's not true, but it's important.
It is important, because if the Palestinians did not begin the BDS movement, then the question, of course, is, who did? BDS expert Professor Gerald Steinberg in Jerusalem says BDS is a creation of European socialists and Muslim nations who oppose Israel, led by the 57-nation Organization of the Islamic Conference, the largest voting bloc at the United Nations.
They get together with the radical left, started with the Soviet Union, certainly filters over to the Trotskyites and the Labour Party in the UK, and many other radical allies. And the fact that this is in many ways a European radical political movement makes it even less legitimate.
There have been boycotts of Israel since before the creation of the State of Israel. Some even trace the boycotts back to Nazi Germany in 1933. But the modern BDS movement took shape at the 2001 UN Conference Against Racism in Durban, South Africa, an event so rife with blatant anti-Semitism that the US and Israeli delegations walked out. Kenneth Marcus is president of the Louis D. Brandeis Center for Human Rights Under Law.
People were distributing or selling copies of the so-called Protocols of the Elders of Zion. There were people there supporting Nazism and urging a return to Nazi anti-Semitism. From that movement, the new BDS campaign emerged.
Another key question is who funds BDS? Steinberg says the movement gets hundreds of millions of dollars a year. Some of its funding is difficult to track. But if you live in a Western nation, there's a good chance you help fund it through your tax dollars, and perhaps even your tithe. The BDS movement gets most of its funding from the European Union, European national governments, and even the US government, who give money to NGOs or non-governmental organizations that claim to fight for human rights, but who also oppose the State of Israel.
Amnesty International, Ken Roth from Human Rights Watch. These organizations are funded by governments under the label of international aid, promoting human rights, promoting peace and development. The Swiss, the Swedes, the Norwegians, the British, Germans, up and down. The money there is huge.
Some Christian charities also give money to BDS. The webpage for Christian Aid makes it look like it only fights poverty. Drill down on their website and you'll find they also support BDS, as does the Presbyterian Church USA. And while the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement has been in one respect a failure, it has accomplished very little in the policy arena. It has succeeded in another area, by spreading anti-Semitism across college campuses.
What we're seeing increasingly is that BDS activists are intimidating student governments at colleges and universities to pay for their activities, and if they don't, there may be repercussions.
Aggressively confronting and sometimes assaulting Jewish students and faculty at pro-Israel events. Ronnie Fraser, founding director of the Academic Friends of Israel, warns the next generation of leaders is being brainwashed, that Israel is the worst nation on earth.
students are being fed a diet of Israel is a racist state, Israel is a Zionist state, Israel equals the Nazis.
We support the Intifada!
With massive funding behind it, BDS is turning people against Israel and creating a generation of leaders who may someday try to carry out what some have said is the real goal of the BDS movement: the elimination of the State of Israel. Dale Hurd, CBN News.
Up next, find out the top 10 countries in the world responsible for the persecution of Christians. You may be surprised by number 1. A list is out naming the 50 most dangerous countries for Christians. Muslim nations dominate the top 10 on the list, but not the number 1 spot. Paul Strand visited the National Press Club to find out who holds that dubious distinction.
Some folks may think civilization is on the rise, but religious freedom certainly isn't. In the world right now, some 250 million Christians face persecution. That means 1 out of 12 face some sort of danger where they live just because of their faith.
Every year, the anti-persecution group Open Doors puts out the World Watch List, subtitling it this year, the 50 countries where it's most dangerous to follow Jesus. Open Doors president blasted number 1 on the list North Korea and its dictator Kim Jong-un.
Imagine in your mind a leader who thinks he is God, but acts like an animal, devouring his own people.
David Curry blames Islamic extremists for some of the world's worst abuses, especially against women.
We found 2,260 women who were forced into marriage, who were raped, who had sexual assault by Muslim extremists.
An international advocate for religious freedom said it's important to remember the persecuted, like an American pastor held in a Turkish prison.
I met with Pastor Andrew Brunson in Turkey earlier this year, and his biggest fear is to be forgotten.
A top congressional fighter for religious freedom said the U.S. does big business with many of these persecuting nations.
A lot of these are countries that we have billion-dollar agreements with. And certainly I think it's important to know that when we are sending taxpayer dollars to some of these countries that we know what is going on.
Curry started this news conference by dedicating it to a 47-year-old nun who faced death threats for working in Jesus' name with the poorest people in India.
2 Hindu extremists came to her medical clinic, attacked her, raped her, drugged her, and left her unconscious, tied to a bed.
He asked American Christians to pray for people like this persecuted nun every Sunday and push for justice.
That seems so obvious, but until the voice and the heart of the American church is heard on this subject, I don't think much will be done.
They say one thing Congress could do is halt the months-long holdup of Kansas Governor Sam Brownback's appointment as ambassador-at-large for international freedom.
The people who suffer are people around the world who do not have a voice and cannot have a voice because people who should be their voice are not there for them.
We need a point person. This is not a partisan issue. Democrat or Republican, independent, you need to care about the religious liberty of others.
Persecution of Christians is on the rise. We cannot turn a blind eye to this evil, and the United States must continue to hold our friends and our enemies accountable.
For those who think nothing can be done about this, well, our government can certainly do more financially, and believers can do something prayerfully for their brethren persecuted around the world. Paul Strand, CBN News, Washington.
Coming up, take a trip with us here in Israel to where Jesus walked on the Jesus Trail. Israel's Ministry of Tourism announced that 3.6 million tourists visited Israel in 2017, more than in any other year in its history. Christian tourists make up the majority of those tourists, and when they come, most want to see the places where Jesus walked. Take a look at this story we did a few years ago about the Jesus Trail. For 2,000 years, Christians have made spiritual journeys to Israel. Today, most visitors travel in tour buses. Now, there is a way to literally walk where Jesus walked. The Jesus Trail, a 4-day trek, offers a chance to slow down and absorb the sights and sounds of the Galilee, where Jesus lived and ministered. Co-founders Israeli Maoz Inon and American David Landis are experienced international hikers. They say creating a Galilee trail where Jesus walked was just natural.
It just seemed to make a lot of sense of how the Jesus Trail could bring a lot of new life to the Galilee, transform the communities, and give people, Christians, or just travelers and pilgrims, a way to really experience the life of Jesus in an authentic way that was very meaningful to them.
Marked with orange and white stripes, or an orange dot, the trail begins in Nazareth, now the largest Arab city in Israel. A guidebook, map, or GPS coordinates help show the way. The 36-mile trail winds across natural terrain, through towns like Cana that are full of history, and over land with spectacular views.
We think it's very similar to the way Jesus would have walked. From the Bible, it talks about Jesus going from Nazareth to Capernaum.
On the first day, hikers come to the ancient town of Sipori. While the city is not mentioned in the Bible, it would have been under construction at the time of Jesus. Some scholars speculate that Joseph, and maybe even Jesus himself, worked there as builders. This part of the trail is about a day-and-a-half's journey from Jesus' hometown of Nazareth. It's on the way to an ancient Roman road. It's likely Jesus took that road on his way from Nazareth to the Sea of Galilee.
I think it's just interesting to think about how connected Jesus' geography was to the rest of the world during his time. Just the influences he would have had, the different languages he would have heard.
This Roman road was part of an ancient trade route connecting Egypt with Damascus and Mesopotamia. Today it's covered with weeds, but still located near a major travel and transportation junction in the Galilee.
Think of like how the internet connects people today. Like that's how Roman roads connected people during the time of Jesus.
Nature is also part of the Bible story. The locusts John the Baptist ate were probably carobs from a tree like this. Jesus cursed the fig tree when it had no fruit. And olive trees are biblical symbols of beauty and prosperity. Their fruit gave oil to anoint the priests and light the temple. By the third day, hikers get their first glimpse of the Sea of Galilee. The volcanic mountain, known as the Horns of Hittim, is the site of an ancient battle, which led to Islamic forces dominating the Holy Land and reconquering Jerusalem.
From here you can see, basically, most of the trails are out. You can see the area of Jesus' ministry along the Sea of Galilee here, and you can see the end point of the trail, which is Capernaum. You can sit under a tree in the shade and just look at where you've come and think about where you're going.
This is Mount Arbel. The cliff towers more than 1,000 feet above the Sea of Galilee. In Jesus' day, there was a Jewish town here, and travelers crossed through the valley below on their way from Nazareth to Capernaum. Next, you'll go to the traditional site of the Mount of Beatitudes, where Jesus preached his Sermon on the Mount. The last stop is Capernaum. Peter lived here, and Jesus used the town as his base during his years of ministry in the Galilee. And Jesus went about all Galilee, teaching in their synagogues, preaching the gospel of the kingdom, and healing all kinds of sickness, all kinds of disease among the people. So far in the last year, an estimated 1,000 people have walked the Jesus Trail. Landis says he thinks the number could grow to 100,000 each year, as more and more people come to Israel to walk where Jesus walked. Up next, take a look at the 70-year history of Israel in sand and music. This month, Israel's government press office held its annual New Year's toast with the Prime Minister. As part of the entertainment, an artist told the 70-year history of Israel through sand art. We thought it was so fascinating, we wanted to show you some of it too. Take a look. We found that a unique way to tell Israel's history and hope you like it. That's all for this edition. Thanks for joining us. Remember, you can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or YouTube. I'm Chris Mitchell. We'll see you next time on Jerusalem Dateline.